What's up, gang? Van Jackson here. A while back, a friend of the pod asked me what subscriptions I'd recommend for news and analysis on world politics. And it was actually a hard question to answer on the spot, believe it or not. But I've got a great answer now. Mother effin' World Politics Review. If you're a fan of Undiplomatic, you should be reading World Politics Review. It's obviously worldly, it's in the title. It's not obsessed with Trump, and it has a great mix of analysis and journalism. Also, why do you think I'm doing this pitch? World Politics Review is an official sponsor of the show, and the best way to back us right now is to back them. So give them a chance. They're offering a 25% discount subscription for Undiplomatic listeners, and if you want to subscribe to their daily newsletter, which you should, you can do it for free. Just visit wpr.pub/undiplomatic. That's wpr.pub/undiplomatic. That'll get you the free newsletter, and it'll also provide you the code for the 25% discount should you want to subscribe. So get on the train, wpr.pub/undiplomatic. Peace. What's up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson, and today we have a hell of a treat for you. This is our latest edition of the Hustle series of the Undiplomatic Podcast. These are episodes where I sit down and interview somebody who's doing cool shit in the foreign policy space. In this case, it's somebody also whom I admire, Matt Duss, the fucking one and only, right? We've been talking about him on the show for a long time. This is Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor. Big fucking get. This is so juicy, man. You are going to love this conversation. We talk about, obviously, his career and how he grew up, how he got into the DC bubble and foreign affairs, and how he ended up working for Sanders, but also, what the left should think about things like Space Force, Middle East policy, fucking U.S.-China policy, and like what the left position should be on the issue of decoupling. So a wide-ranging conversation. We clear up the whole fucking Transformers versus the Usual Suspects debacle from one of our very early episodes. Big controversy. This thing is amazing. Have a listen. I hope you enjoy, and then rate us on iTunes and all that good shit. Peace. You came on my radar first because of Dan Nexon, who I guess is like a mutual friend.
Yeah,
right. Several years ago. How did you meet Dan?
Well, I met Dan through Lawyers, Guns and Money, because Rob Farley and I are old buddies. Rob and I, and actually the whole Lawyers, Guns and Money crew. I was with them at UW. So Rob was actually finishing his PhD when I was just starting my graduate work. In my kind of long, meandering college and graduate school career. But yeah, so I knew those guys, and I think Dan even before he joined up with LGM, but then when he became close with those guys, that's kind of how I got connected with him.
Oh, okay. I didn't know you and Farley had a thing. That's cool.
Yeah.
He had some argument several years ago about getting rid of the Air Force entirely, which was the most mind-blowing thing I had ever heard, and I was like, whoa.
No, he wrote a book. It's a good book. It's a good argument. Yeah. And that's why it's funny that you asked me about Space Force, and my response is well, I kind of agree with my buddy Rob that we shouldn't have an Air Force.
Nice.
But
yeah, we'll get there. If we can just start at the beginning, where did you grow up? What did your parents do? Was politics in your life coming up?
Yeah. Well, I was born and raised in a small town called Nyack, New York. That's just up the Hudson River from New York City, about 20 minutes. My dad was a journalist when I was growing up. My mom was a teacher and then a nurse. And politics was very much in my family because my dad was actually born in a refugee camp in Germany after World War II. His parents were Ukrainian refugees, and they came to this country when he was very young. And so just that kind of consciousness of where my father had come from, where his family came from, Ukrainian being spoken in their house all the time. He grew up in Greenpoint. We would be down there all the time in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, heavily Russian, Polish, Ukrainian neighborhood, but discussions, this is the late 70s and the 80s, the Cold War. So just kind of an understanding of those issues was a big part of my upbringing.
Cool. So did you stay in New York up through college?
No, when I graduated high school, I went to a small college in northern Massachusetts called Gordon College, just north of Boston. And I spent a couple years there. And then I dropped out of college and took let's call it a very long sabbatical, do a number of things, moved across the country, moved to Seattle, had a bunch of different jobs, tried a bunch of things, and eventually went back and finished my BA in 2003, and then went to grad school at University of Washington shortly after that.
Were you in Seattle during the anti-globalization protests?
I was there for the lead up to it. I actually wasn't there for the protests. I had come back to DC for a brief time to attend just a semester of college in DC before going back out to Seattle. But I was, watching it from afar, but was also involved in some of the organizing for the protests that took place in DC that following April around the IMF and World Bank. So was, following that and involved in, that generally.
So you were not, so it would be an understatement to say that you were not surprised by those protests. Because I feel like a lot of not normal, but mainstream sort of Starbucks drinking people were caught off guard by those protests.
I mean, I was aware they were coming. I saw the organizing that was going on, but I was certainly surprised by the size and intensity. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of the people who were helping organize it were surprised by the size and intensity, and certainly, by the police response, which is, something we've obviously seen in the last few weeks once again.
Yeah, and that was before the hyper militarization cowboy cop phenomenon.
No, I think that's before the cops had all this new equipment that they've gotten because of the war on terror. Yeah. But I think a lot of these tactics, the kettling, the so-called, First Amendment zones that, the Bush administration put in place post 9/11 at the conventions, I think a lot of these got the kind of first run in Seattle and in DC the following April.
Yeah, it's funny. My political consciousness first opened up because of the LA riots in 92. And a lot of people look back, and for one thing, at the time, nobody knew how far it was going to go or how bad it was going to get. But a lot of people look back and were like, well, those riots were worth it because we did get some reforms in LA out of it, right? And it did raise a public consciousness. But the cops also used that experience to develop new best practices for how to literally violently squelch protest and block it off. They figured out ways to make it harder and harder to give public voice to these things.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's right. I mean, if I had to think of my, first real political consciousness, I'd probably have to go back to the Solidarity movement in Poland. Because like I said, I mean, these issues, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe were very, very much present in the conversations that were going around me. But I do very specifically remember, this picture, I think it was the cover of Time or Newsweek, and they were, Polish workers, Polish strikers. And my dad just explaining to me, you need to understand how brave these people are and what they are doing. And that really stuck with me. And I actually had the opportunity to go to the Solidarity Museum in Gdańsk just a couple of years ago when I was in Poland, and it meant a great, great deal to me. It's a really amazing museum.
Wow, that's cool. Okay, so you finished your BA in 2003. What did you study?
Well, I studied political science. I mean, when I originally went to college, the first round, it was creative writing. Short stories, fiction, some poetry, but I'd also, I'd been writing, ever since I was a little kid. Writing was something that I always liked doing. But in the intervening years, I'd always been kind of interested in politics and interested in foreign policy, but also interested in the Middle East, and a number of events took place over those years, including one of the most important was a trip to Turkey in 2000. A friend of mine got married, so my wife and I went to their wedding in Istanbul and spent 2 weeks in Istanbul, and it just, it completely blew my mind. It's the first time I'd ever been to a Muslim country. Hearing the call to prayer the first morning I was there, just, kind of 2 weeks is barely enough to scratch the surface of what Istanbul has to offer. But I really, after that, I was really hooked on the region, its history and what it meant. And then, of course, September 11th, 2001 happens, and everyone has an opinion on this region and on Islam. And so much of what was being thrown at us and being fed to us seemed just absolutely wrong to me. And I think that's, those events are what kind of led me to focus on the region professionally.
Interesting. So you graduate from college, you've developed a deep interest in the Middle East, and at this point, 9/11 has happened. So did you finish school before we started the Iraq invasion or just after? Or?
It had just happened. So it was June 2003 when I, officially got my BA.
Do you regret supporting the Iraq War? I'm just kidding.
No, I mean, it's even looking back on it now and seeing how I was processing the arguments. I mean, we know what we know about now, but I remember at the time, like, the idea that they would just blatantly misrepresent. I mean, it seems sketchy, but I'll admit to even being surprised at the extent to which it all just turned out to be baloney, something of such deep import.
Yeah.
And the costs, and I think that, again, that's been part of, my own political education, is not only like people will say these things and kind of float these arguments and create these echo chambers to advance a really disastrous policy. But, as I decided to focus on Middle East studies and focus on Middle East policy, seeing journalists and policy professionals and people and pundits making these claims about the region and about Iraq that were based in nothing.
Yeah.
They were based on like zero knowledge. And those people are still making good money doing that today.
Yeah, it's rough. It's rough. Slate had this sort of like look back at who was saying what about Iraq invasion in like late 2002, early 2003. And it was all familiar names, all, the normal like Washington Post, New York Times columnists, the talking heads on like MSNBC. And the way it's interesting, the like nuanced take that you had on like thinking about Iraq at the time, because I was opposed to the war, but it felt kind of like a 52-48 kind of thing because of how many mainstream legit people were putting their name on this decision. I think we lose that now, but it's remarkable the lack of accountability, or like just the fact that like it's whitewash, like nobody owns this, it's a little frustrating. I don't know. So what was your first job in international affairs? How did you clearly have an interest and a background. How did you get into the market?
Well, I had been interested in reading blogs and wrote my own little blog, starting, I think I first heard about Blogger back in like early 2001, like a buddy, I had just moved back to Seattle, and a friend of mine was like, yo, there's this thing where you can just like write stuff and publish it on the web right away. And I was like, sign me up. So I was following it that way, but I knew I wanted to, focus on Middle East policy, but from kind of a writing and reporting standpoint. So I finished my master's in Middle East studies. I focused on Iraq. I actually wrote my thesis on Muqtada al-Sadr and the Mahdi army.
Oh, wow.
Was the focus of my master's thesis. And then I came to DC right after that. And, wrote a few pieces freelance, and then finally took an editorial internship at the American Prospect magazine, which was a magazine I really liked.
Yeah.
They had a lot of great writers. They actually had one of the first and best group blogs, Tapped, if people remember that back in the day. Yeah. And I just took the opportunity to, it was unpaid, but just that was the way I kind of got in the mix. And, they let me write a few items, blog posts, and they were like, okay, this guy sort of knows what he's talking about. And they just let me start writing for the blog whenever I wanted. And that was how I got my, started, getting my work out there. And from there, I was hired by the Center for American Progress to be the national security editor for the Think Progress blog. Now dearly departed Think Progress.
That's sad. I applied to Think Progress at one point when there was like an assistant editorship or something that came up, but it was on paper at the time. I had no accomplishments, and I looked, I don't know, basically like a militarist on paper, because it's like, working in intelligence and like, enlisted military background, and like I didn't look like a good fit. So it was understandable that I got passed over, and I had done nothing. Okay, so interesting. So when Podesta set up Center for American Progress, I remember reading that like he was trying to create almost like a farm team for, Democratic Party intellectualism about foreign policy. Like he had read some profile about Paul Wolfowitz, and he was freaked out by the actual content of Wolfowitz's ideology, but he thought it was very like smart that he actually did have like a coherent way of thinking that he could then sell to Republicans, and like he wanted some base for intellectual fodder for the Democratic Party. It sounds like it's worked in your case, right? I mean, like you're part of this world, and like you got a foothold there.
Right. No, I think that's a very, very fair point. And I think in general, I mean, that vision that Podesta had and others had with him, I mean, not just CAP. I think CAP was like the most prominent organization, but there were a number of organizations, Media Matters and some others.
Oh, that's right.
It was this recognition, that progressives, Democrats, liberals, I mean, were just being outspent, outinvested, outorganized in terms of creating a policy infrastructure to create ideas, to train young professionals, to put these ideas into the media bloodstream, and to really engage in the battle of ideas in a way that we needed to. So I do give them a lot of credit for that.
Okay, so you're at Think Progress, you're doing God's work there, and then how long are you there before you move on, and what do you move on to?
So I was at Think Progress for a while, and then around 2011, I moved from Think Progress over to the policy team to just do Middle East policy work. CAP's policy team, right? So I focused on Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Israel, Palestine, broader kind of regional issues. And then I was there until 2014, when I was asked to be the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. So that started in August of 2014, and I was there until January of 2017, which is when I joined Bernie's staff in the Senate.
Oh, so I missed this. I thought you were with Sanders in 2016. So it was after the election.
No, it was after the election. So I wasn't with his campaign in 2016, although I did testify on his campaign's behalf on the issue of Israel-Palestine in front of the Platform Committee in I think it was June 2016. So I did have some relationship, with his team, but not officially because I was running the foundation.
2017 was also when Sanders made his first big foreign policy speech, which I'm guessing is not a coincidence, or is that the right timing? Like, you were on board for that?
Well, yeah, I think the one in September of 2017 that he gave in Fulton, Missouri, where Churchill, at their annual kind of Churchill seminar, they had invited him to speak there. He liked the idea of going there, the optics of that, because he really, we had been talking through a big foreign policy speech to start articulating his broader vision for a while, and that seemed like a good opportunity to do that.
And at this point, it's he's running again for the nomination in 2020.
He came out of 2016, obviously, with a much bigger platform, the ability to put issues on the agenda, and he really wanted foreign policy to be among those issues on which he was pushing. And that's part of the reason why he asked me to join his staff. So that's the way we were looking at it. It's like, listen, we have this opportunity to kind of articulate a critique of the way America has been doing foreign policy, but also to offer a kind of positive, affirmative vision of America's role in the world. And that's what he did there.
Yeah, no, that's totally what it was too. So how did you guys organize foreign policy for the campaign once you actually started, running for president? There's no like right way to do it. There are many models. How did you structure it?
Well, I think it's structured around the way, how does Bernie get what he needs? I mean, how does Bernie absorb these issues? How does he like to discuss them? How does he engage with them? And so I think in my view, I don't have a lot of experience in this. I did make a point to talk to a number of other, I mean, this goes back to even first when I joined his staff. I made a point to talk to a lot of people who'd worked in the Senate, who'd worked in government, to make sure I knew, I wanted to get my boss what he needed to do the job he was trying to do. Mm-hmm. But I think, so it's like we had a fairly, a group, it's not large. It was not large by, the standards of these things. I'd say we had, maybe 30 to 40 experts on a whole range of issue areas, regional experts, et cetera. My friend Rob Farley was a real help in this, in coordinating a lot of this work. So we had people producing papers, working together and independently, but also, experts we could call upon at a moment's notice when issues popped to help brief Bernie, to talk through some of these issues with him on specifics as they arose.
So Rob Farley was heavily sort of involved in wrangling some outside talent, or has that?
Well, no, in helping bring folks on, but also helping them work with each other and produce material for the campaign. Yeah, he was a huge help.
Okay. How much did you reach into, Washington versus outside Washington? Or maybe that's not the right split, like establishment versus outside.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
no, I know what you mean, but I think we did both. I mean, I want, Bernie wants to hear from just people who know stuff. Mm-hmm. And obviously he wants to hear from people who are criticizing the conventional wisdom. He wants to think bigger. But he also, it's not like he doesn't, I think neither he nor I have this kind of reflexive suspicion of Washington expertise. So we want to hear from folks in Washington. We want to hear from military experts. We want to hear, we asked Admiral Mullen to come in. He came in and spoke with Bernie. A number of other people that might be seen as establishment have been in, and those conversations were great and very useful.
Interesting. So how much do you see yourself as, this is a weird question, like part of the establishment versus not? Like, you've been in DC a while, but Cap has been sort of a unique place relative to most of like the think tank world. And I mean, you're still there now, but you've been there with Sanders, who most certainly is not like part of the establishment. That's dividing line. Like, how do you see yourself as like insider or outsider or rebel? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's hard. I did spend time at CAP, then the foundation, and then in the Senate for the past, almost 4 years or 3.5 years. So it's hard to characterize myself as an outsider. But I would say it's, someone who does, I do have a pretty, strong critique of the conventional wisdom. I think some of the presumptions that have guided American foreign policy have been proven wrong. And I think there are more and more people who are articulating some of these criticisms. I think that is gaining a lot of energy. In fact, I think that is one of the most interesting and exciting things, that I'm observing right now. And I think you may be too, is that, for the first time in my lifetime, the most energy in foreign policy is coming from the left.
Yeah.
That is where the most interesting conversation about American foreign policy is happening right now. So I'm really, glad to be in a spot where I can reach out to some of these folks that might not have had, an opportunity to engage with the kind of quote unquote establishment conversation before, and help, promote some of these ideas as we're in this process of rethinking, what is America's role in the world? What is American policy really for?
Yeah. It seems like this is one of the reasons why it's so fucking awesome to talk to you too. Like, you / of course Senator Sanders have opened up this space. Like, it's really hard to see how this conversation on foreign policy would have moved left the way that it has. Just the intellectual interest that the left has in foreign policy right now, if it wasn't for that pivot in 2017 where he's actually laying out like a field theory that's uniting like foreign and domestic policy, and providing an actual vision, something to graft onto, to say that it's okay to, not reflexively embrace, I don't know, sanctions on Iran, or just like whatever the stated position is, to think differently. Right. Like, it feels like it's okay now to come up with different ideas. Like, you guys have played a huge role in opening up that space.
No, I appreciate that, and I think I got to give credit to my boss. I mean, it was an enormous opportunity and a privilege to work with him on this, and it still is.
So you're not an outsider, clearly. I don't know if I would call you establishment, but what are your concerns about the establishment?
Well, there are people on Twitter who are convinced that I am like a secret neocon plant on Bernie's team. So so.
Wow.
But I'm I assume there are people even further to their left who see those people as sellouts. So
yeah.
I'll just take
watching
some
the watchers. Yeah. But I mean, like, what, in your view, you have a good sort of like skeptical position relative to established wisdom. You're not like reflexively hostile to established wisdom, but you have no problem questioning it. Like, what you clearly, Iraq War was wrong, a bad call. What could be done to make the establishment better, or like, more? How would you like the establishment to be, I guess?
I would like to take all of my ideas on board and immediately define them as the new consensus. I think part of what we need, and I think there's a recognition here, and this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the energy on the left in foreign policy, is that part of what we need, and this goes back actually to Podesta's idea about what eventually created CAP and some of these other organizations, but specifically foreign policy making institutions that can give young people opportunities, that can mentor people to create the policy professionals of the future, that can cultivate ideas, get those ideas discussed, and basically have the resources to allow creative thinkers to take risks and offer bold ideas. And that's something we still lack. I think that's changing, but we are not close to being there yet.
Yeah. So speaking of bold, or maybe this is not the right segue, but what what do you think of Biden's foreign policy so far, / kind of like where you see it going? Do you have any concerns about a kind of Obama 2.0?
I mean, well, I'll say a couple things about that. One is, I think it is, we don't need to get into, Biden, the Iraq War. I think Bernie articulated that criticism. I think I'll say this. I think, Biden has made some really important commitments, say, in returning to the Iran nuclear agreement, diplomacy with Iran, to arrive in the White House with a mandate to do that is no small thing. Yeah. I think the grounds on this have shifted considerably in the last few years. I think the fact that the Democratic Party, the caucus in the Senate and in the House has held together like overwhelmingly, just unanimously in favor of rejoining the agreement is a huge development.
Yeah.
But, I'll go back to this remark that Obama made back in the primary in 2008 that I've mentioned before, and, others have mentioned, where he said, I don't want to just end the Iraq War. I want to end the mindset that got us into the war in the first place.
Yeah.
Ending that mindset is, in my view, the most succinct description of the progressive foreign policy project that you can find. And I would love to hear more from Biden about how committed he is to changing that mindset.
Yeah.
I think we've seen some moves. I would love to see more. But I'll just say this. I'll end on a positive note here. Going back to his speech that Biden gave last week, it wasn't specifically on foreign policy. It was about the protests. It was about what we're seeing, after the murder of George Floyd, where I think Biden, for the first time, just rejected the idea that Trump is an anomaly.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important because he's not an anomaly. He is a product of the status quo. He is a product of American politics. And we really all need to think about how, American politics, but particularly foreign policy, particularly the war on terror, has created this environment that gave rise to Trump.
Yeah. I think that's one of the most pernicious ideas in the, establishment, so to speak, is that Trump is a one-off rather than a symptom of something. That's very well put, actually. So you're covering all of the foreign policy space for Sanders, but you started as a Middle East guy. You have that domain expertise kind of first. What, in your domain expertise of the Middle East, what would you like to see from, a Biden presidency in 2021?
Well, I think I think rejoining the Iran nuclear agreement, but also the broader diplomacy that will need to accompany that, gives a big opportunity to do a number of things. One is to kind of withdraw the United States from one side of the Saudi-Iran regional Cold War conflict, whatever you want to call it. I mean, just straight up, the United States has no interest in just choosing one side and backing that one side in this regional conflict. I think what we can and should be doing, and Bernie has talked about this, is, we have a lot of leverage in this region still. Even though it's diminished, our relative share of power has declined. We still have a lot of power, and we should be investing in helping to, create a regional security architecture that doesn't require American intervention every few years. And no, I think this is very consistent with things that Obama was talking about. Even if, we don't expect the Iranians and the Saudis to be close friends, we at least can, build towards something where they're not at each other's throats, where they're talking about, identifying and working together on some, identified shared interests, and then build on that. And that's where I'd like to see the focus to be.
How do you feel about, maybe I know the answer to this. How do you feel about the continuing arms sales relationship with the Saudis? Is that what you mean by not taking a side?
Well, no, I think it's more than that. It's just, a complete rhetorical wet kiss at every opportunity. It's declaring an emergency, like Pompeo did, and now he's under some heat, deservedly, for declaring an emergency, sidestepping Congress's disapproval to sell more weapons to the Saudis.
Yeah.
I think those sales should be stopped pending review, certainly with regard to Yemen. The Congress has spoken on this issue when they passed the War Powers Resolution. We need to stop supporting this disastrous war. But I also think we need a broader review of these security relationships with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, with the Egyptians. Going back years, I didn't agree with the George W. Bush administration on a great deal, but I do think one of the things that came out post 9/11 was this recognition that, our support for these authoritarian regimes that oppress their own people, that are corrupt, that are not responsive to the needs of their people and are seen as illegitimate, has serious cause for the security of the United States. Now, that's not to say that we should go in and reorganize and reinvent these countries. We lack the tools or the ability to do that. But I think just that recognition is really important.
Yeah, that's a good point. If we can pivot, so to speak, to the kind of big thing happening right now, or this big process that's underway between the U.S. and China, there's no question that Washington, for the foreseeable future, is going to be on a sort of competitive, confrontational footing with China. How that has manifested, aside from the military competition, has been primarily through like a larger process of decoupling. Like we're undoing the like economic interdependence that has forged over a generation, and I just wonder, like, how do you view all of that? China policy generally, but like also this narrow question of decoupling. The next episode of this podcast that I just recorded like 2 days ago, one of the questions we got on the AMA was about what the left thinks about decoupling, because it's kind of a hard question. Because I know Sanders, for example, was not in favor of free trade with China in the past, and that seems reasonable. But does that mean he supports decoupling, or like is it about how it's happening? Like, what's your take on all of this?
Yeah. Well, I think, and I don't think Bernie's addressed this specifically, but yes, he's someone who, and I think quite rightly, has criticized trade deals for not giving enough support to domestic labor movements, to human rights. The theory was, and I think everyone understands this theory was wrong, was like, well, let's help liberalize their economy and everyone will make money and then their politics will get better and they become less authoritarian, and that did not work. I think with regard to decoupling, I think there are obviously really important and very good arguments for not being so dependent on China for a whole range of products, especially those products that, as we see in the pandemic, that Americans need to live.
Yeah.
But I would also say, as we go through this process, and there's, this is a an era-defining shift. What we need to do is find ways to secure and diminish uncertainty on the part of our allies and partners, particularly in that region, right?
Yeah.
And I see the way Trump is, even though I think Trump, when he, launches his trade war with China, the tariffs, I mean, he is, he's exploiting, actual things that Americans feel with some justification. But the way he's going about it is actually creating more uncertainty and more insecurity. So I think as we go through this process of, charting the way forward, it is really important to be working with our allies, to make sure that, all right, we understand the world is changing, but here's what we want to achieve together. And that's something we just don't have right now.
Yeah. The here's what we want to achieve part is not trivial.
Right. And listen, I mean, Trump just has, and this is something he shares with, I think, authoritarian leaders around the world. It's a very zero-sum concept of global power. It's like, if others are benefiting, we must be getting screwed. And I think, understanding power as a positive sum, engagement in multilateral fora, engagement at the UN, even though the UN is often frustrating, no question. But we benefit, the American people, the security and the prosperity of the American people benefit from our engagement in these institutions.
Yeah, there's a little in China policy. There's a little too much like cutting off our nose to spite our face. It's just like it reeks of kind of bad strategy, and it's like even if you have like a competitive frame with China, you could be doing this a lot better, right? Including through institutional architectures and I mean, like there's just I don't know, we're sucking.
No, I think that's right. I mean, because it is. I mean, yes, China's power has grown considerably. America's relative share of power has diminished. But what we do have that China cannot begin to compete with is a network of alliances and partnerships. And securing those and making those are as strong as possible is a very key part of our security and prosperity.
Yeah, no, I agree, man. You're talking to the right guy. So on one more foreign policy question, Space Force, thoughts?
I just didn't think it was that, funny. I mean, I like Steve Carell.
That's funny. I said the exact same thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, these are, security in space. Obviously, we have interest, but did we need our own, new force for this?
New bureaucracy.
I don't. Yeah. A new bureaucracy to compete for resources. I don't think so.
Well, what do you think about the show? You said it was not funny.
I admit to only seeing a couple episodes. I mean, it is kind of funny. I mean, listen, John Malkovich is John Malkovich. Yeah, so, I mean, what more can you say?
Yeah. Well, I guess the most important question I have now that we're like talking about movies comes. I've gotten I've gotten so many requests, AMAs, including on the last episode of the podcast, from people asking me to clarify with you what you meant by venerating Transformers relative to the Usual Suspects movie. For those who aren't familiar, like in a much earlier episode of the pod, like almost at the beginning, at some point I don't even remember exactly what happened, but I was saying something about how Gen Z has not seen The Usual Suspects, which is this great movie. And then I mocked Transformers briefly. And then Gabby weighed in and said like Transformers is big robots, which I felt like was the weakest justification to have seen Transformers relative to not having seen The Usual Suspects. It would all made me fucking very just exasperated. And then I shared this on Twitter, and then Matt fucking saw this and somehow said Transformers is an excellent movie.
No, I did not say Transformers is an excellent movie.
Okay.
All right. So yes, I'm happy for the opportunity to clarify. Obviously, Usual Suspects is a better movie than Transformers.
Okay. Thank you.
I think people should see this movie. It's a great movie. It has,
it's classic.
But I want to say that as an argument, and I just, I remember listening to the episode and hearing Gabby, respond like, this is our Transformers is big robots. That's a strong argument because big robots are dope. Okay. Big robot movies are dope. All right. Transformers is not great as far as big robots movies go, but like, there's a floor below which big robot movies, a coolness floor that exists for big robot movies. Obviously, Pacific Rim is a far superior big robot movie.
Yeah, that's much better.
Not officially big robots; they're just big suits. But that's another episode. But yeah, that's all I was saying. As far as arguments go, if you just got to put it very simply, I had to give her some respect for just coming up with that.
Wow,
that's true. Transformers is big robots, and big robots are cool.
Man, well, so the Transformers movie was not transformative in your life, though. This wasn't some.
No. I mean, Transformers back in the day. I mean, the original Transformers movie, the cartoon one, is actually really, for that genre is worth watching. I remember seeing that in the theater at the time, and Transformers, those toys and everything. But no, I think the Michael Bay movies. I'm not a huge fan of his action movies, although the Bad Boys movies are great. Largely on the strength of Will Smith and Martin Lawrence both being great together. But I love action movies. I think action movies are a great genre. But I'm not a fan of Michael Bay in general.
Interesting. So if you were to pick some movies that defined your life or that are very important to understanding you or shaping you, what would you point to?
Man. So the danger of this is always forgetting some of the important ones, but I'll just try to reel some off. Raiders of the Lost Ark. I remember seeing that in the theater with my dad when it came out. I mean, that movie, and I've used this. I mean, I'm a big fan of music. I play music too, so I often compare things to music. And for me, Raiders of the Lost Ark is the Are You Experienced of action movies. It's it just utterly changed the game. I mean, people are still grappling with what Raiders of the Lost Ark meant in terms of filming action and sustaining this sense of frenzy. That's throughout that movie and a lot of other Spielberg movies, but I think that was the one that really made its mark. So that's a big one.
Yeah.
I'd say in terms of other ones, Hitchcock's Notorious, big one that I love. I watch a lot. I mean, I watch movies over and over again. They're like albums to me. I just want to go and be in that space.
Yeah, me too.
It doesn't matter if I've watched them recently. I will watch. My friends make fun of me because they're like, "What are you doing?" Oh, I'm watching, North by Northwest for the 1,000th time. That's where I want to be right now.
Comfort food, yeah.
I would say Young Frankenstein. I remember seeing that on TV as a kid, and even to this day, I think that movie, but particularly Gene Wilder's, and Gene Hackman is in it, but Gene Wilder's performance in that movie is just one of the funniest things ever put on film.
I've never seen it. That's embarrassing to admit. I've never seen it. I may have to now.
You should do that. So after you've watched it 100 times, we will revisit it.
Nice.
I thought actually one of the best movies, if we're talking about action movies, one of the best movies in the past 10 years, Fury Road.
Fury Road.
Fury Road, yeah. Mad Max.
Yeah.
That movie just blew my mind. And in another vibe, Little Women. Maybe the best movie I saw this year.
That's quite a pairing. Yeah. Little Women and Mad Max.
Greta Gerwig's Little Women. Very, very good.
That's fucking range.
Yeah. Double feature.
Wow. Have you seen any movies in the last year? Any standouts to you?
Yeah. Well, the Little Women, that's the one. I think that may have been the last movie I actually saw in the movie theater before the pandemic hit. Over the past year, Midsommar was a pretty good one. If you
I haven't
heard
seen
of this
it yet.
movie. It's kind of I guess it's a horror movie, but it's all takes place in daylight. Takes place, I forget which Scandinavian country, but if people have seen The Wicker Man, which is another favorite movie of mine, this works a very, very similar vibe. But as far as the last year, I like Knives Out.
Oh man, yeah.
I thought that was a very, very solid. I mean, that was a good, just everything about it, the performances, the sets, the clothes.
Yeah.
That raggy sweater that Chris Evans wears. That was a really good movie. Yeah.
That's become one of my comfort food movies.
Yeah. And, just chewing the scenery with that performance from Daniel Craig, just devouring every piece of scenery.
Yeah. Yeah.
With that.
Well, I feel like I understand you a lot better now.
All right. Well, good.
Although I need to see Young Frankenstein. But other than that,
you do.
This makes sense. Yeah. I appreciate you coming on, man. This has been very enlightening. I have a feeling everyone's going to love this episode too. And I'm glad we cleared up the Transformers thing.
All right. Thanks a lot.
All right.
Great talking to you.
Thanks, dude.